A story such as this, painful, raw, and steeped in betrayal, requires a delicate touch. There's power in the quiet moments, the weight of silence, the dread of unspoken truths, and the slow realization that life, once so certain, has fractured, beyond repair. Let me guide you through this story, not as a simple recounting, but as a slow-burning revelation, layered in emotion and human complexity. The sound of broken things. In the small, quiet town of Ashford, there lived a man named Adam. He was an ordinary man, of sturdy build and quiet ambition, whose life was content in its simplicity. His mornings began with the scent of fresh coffee brewing, his afternoons spent tending to a small vegetable garden in his backyard, and his evenings reserved for his wife, Emily, whose laughter filled the home with warmth and light. Together, they had crafted a life that felt, for all its imperfections, like a sanctuary from the chaos of the world. But that was before the storm came. It started, as most great tragedies do, with something small. A slight change in Emily's behavior, a late night at work that turned into 2, then 3. Adam noticed it, of course, but his mind refused to connect the dots. How could he? The life they had built was solid, wasn't it? 1,000 little memories flooded his mind, each one cementing the belief that love, true love, could withstand anything. That was before the accident. One afternoon, as Adam was working in the garden, tending to a patch of sunflowers, he felt a sharp pain in his back, a sudden searing that brought him to his knees. Then the world spun violently, and the next thing he knew, he was lying motionless, on the cold, damp grass. His body, once strong, capable, had betrayed him. His spine had fractured, leaving him paralyzed from the waist down. The weeks that followed were a blur of hospital rooms, physical therapy, and a slow, painful awakening to a new reality. The man who had once moved with ease, whose hands had built everything from the fence around his yard to the plans for their future, was now dependent on others for the most basic of needs. And Emily? Emily was there, but only just. She hovered at the edges of his recovery, her eyes clouded with a sorrow Adam couldn't understand. It wasn't the sorrow of love or concern, but something darker, something that Adam refused to see. There was the neighbor, Derek, a man with a grin too wide, a voice too smooth, a presence too pervasive. He'd lived next door for years, always friendly, always too eager to offer help. At first, Adam appreciated Derek's visits. He was, after all, a kind man, a good neighbor. But as the weeks passed, something in Derek's eyes began to change. There was a hunger there, a predatory gleam that Adam, in his fragile state, couldn't confront. As Adam's condition worsened, Emily's visits became less frequent. She'd come home late, smelling faintly of perfume that wasn't hers, and when she kissed him on the forehead, it lacked the warmth that once made Adam's heart soar. But it wasn't until that fateful evening, when the sun had set and the house was wrapped in a suffocating quiet, that Adam knew the truth. His world had been shattered once more, not by the accident, but by the revelation that his greatest fear, the one that had lingered at the back of his mind since the first time he noticed the change in Emily, was now a reality. It was a simple thing, really. A sound, a creak of the floorboards from downstairs, followed by hushed laughter. It wasn't loud enough to be fully heard, but Adam's instincts were sharper than his body. He knew what it meant. He had once thought, the worst of the world could be kept at bay. But the world, it seems, has a way of unraveling even the tightest knots. With a quiet groan, Adam turned his head to the side, straining against his immobile body, and saw them. Emily, with her hair undone, her face flushed with an emotion that was not love, and Derek, standing too close, his hands too bold, his lips too eager. They didn't see him, or perhaps they did, and simply didn't care. In that moment, Adam was gripped by a feeling he had never known, a feeling so visceral, so deep, that it left him breathless. It was not the pain of his body, not the ache of his paralysis. No, it was the emptiness that comes when trust is destroyed, when the very foundation of a life is reduced to dust. The man he had been, strong, capable, certain, had vanished, and in his place was something hollow, something broken. Emily's betrayal had carved a wound too deep to heal, and yet Adam felt something else as well, a strange, quiet resolve. In that room, as he lay motionless, he realized that his body might be paralyzed, but his mind still held power. It would take time? Yes. Time to heal. Time to rebuild. Time to figure out what was left of the man who had once trusted her. But in that silence, with nothing but the sound of broken things echoing through the house, Adam understood the weight of what remains. The days that followed were heavy, like walking through a fog that clung to every thought, every movement. Adam's paralysis, both physical and emotional, seemed to extend far beyond the confines of his body. He would lie in that bed, staring at the ceiling, and time would stretch and contract like an elastic band, each moment suspended in a kind of surreal stasis. It was as though the world had moved on without him, while he was trapped in an endless loop, paralyzed not just in body but in his very existence. Emily still came home each night. Her presence became like a ghost's. No warmth, no light, just the faint trace of someone who had once been his everything. She never spoke of what had happened. She never acknowledged the distance between them. There were no apologies, no confessions, not even an excuse. She would sit by his bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, and sometimes, just sometimes, she would touch his hand. But even her touch felt hollow, like a gesture made out of habit rather than love. It was clear as the days passed that Emily was a different person, and Adam, though still aching, began to realize that the woman he had loved, the woman he had trusted with every part of his soul, was no longer the same. She had been consumed by something, by Derek, by guilt, by a part of herself that had always existed but had remained dormant, a part that Adam never truly knew. But the betrayal had carved a new part of Adam, too. Not the man he had once been, but a version of him that was starting to rise from the ruins. A version of him who would not allow the actions of another to dictate his worth, his future, or his fate. The days turned into weeks, and with each passing moment, Adam grew quieter. He spoke less, but his mind, his heart, became more determined. He could not walk, not yet, but there was no law, no physical boundary that could hold him prisoner forever. One evening, Emily was late again. She had been out for hours, her absence longer than usual. Adam waited in the dim light of their bedroom, the clock ticking slowly on the wall. He knew, deep down, that she wasn't out just with friends or at work. He had learned enough over the weeks to understand the cadence of her lies, the shifts in her eyes, the nervous energy that came when she returned after spending time with Derek. That night, the sound of Emily's car pulling into the driveway was a sharp, unmistakable noise, so sharp it felt like a signal to the conclusion of something, the end of a chapter that had long since lost its meaning. Adam's heart didn't race as it once might have. It simply beat. Steady, mechanical, indifferent to the storm that had raged around him. When she walked in, her face was flushed, her eyes slightly bloodshot. She carried the faintest scent of Derek's cologne. But Adam said nothing. He had no words left for her. Not anymore. She set her purse down by the door, lingering there for a moment. She could feel the shift in the air, the weight of the silence hanging between them. Adam turned his head slightly toward her, his eyes, once full of love and devotion, now empty, unreadable. "Adam," she started, her voice cracking with the hesitation of someone who had long since known the truth, and yet still found it difficult to speak it aloud. He interrupted her, not with anger, not with harsh words, but with a cold, steady voice that cut through the space like a blade. "You've done what you've done, Emily, and I've seen it. I know it." Her eyes widened. The guilt she had been trying to bury finally surfacing like a rising tide, but Adam was no longer interested in her excuses. He wasn't interested in her guilt or her tears. What was left to say? What more could be said? "I don't need your apologies," he continued. His voice, though quiet, held the weight of someone who had come to understand the most painful of truths. "I don't need your lies. What I need is to know whether or not you are still here because of love or because you can't bear the thought of leaving." She didn't answer him immediately. She simply stood there, as if paralyzed, herself, torn between the reality of what she had done and the desire to hold on to the life they once shared. "I think—" She swallowed, her eyes welling with tears. "I think I stayed because I don't know how to live without you." Adam's gaze softened, but only slightly. He knew better than anyone that words, especially ones born of fear, meant little in the face of such deep betrayal. Love, once so simple and pure, had turned into something unrecognizable, something twisted and broken. "If you can't leave me, Emily, then what's left for us?" Adam asked, the question heavy in the space between them. "What's left if trust is gone?" She opened her mouth, but no words came. In that moment, Adam realized something else. She wasn't the only one who had been paralyzed. The path toward the light, the days after Emily left, were a strange kind of limbo. Adam had always been a man who believed in certainty, in the small rhythms of life that made everything feel anchored, until they didn't. Now, everything around him felt foreign, like an unfamiliar landscape where every step took more effort than it should. The house was too quiet without her, but it was also strangely soothing. The weight of her absence was heavy, yes, but there was no longer the constant reminder of her betrayal, no longer the strained attempts to pretend that things were normal when they were anything but. It was just him, alone, a thought that might have crushed him before the accident, but now it offered him something he hadn't realized he was missing: freedom. At first, the silence was oppressive. The walls seemed to close in on him, and there were times when he wondered if he could survive in this hollow space. But little by little, Adam began to adjust. He started a routine, one that didn't involve Emily or Derek or the memories of things that had once been good. He got up each morning, not because he had to, but because he chose to. He would look out the window at the small garden he'd planted before the accident, now overgrown and wild, and he'd make a mental note to tend to it once his body allowed him to move more freely again. He would sit by the window, feeling the sun warm. His skin, as he really thought about what kind of man he wanted to be now. Not the man who had been cheated on, not the man who had been paralyzed, but the man who was still here, still breathing, still able to decide what came next. But there were harder days, too. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, when the darkness seemed too thick to cut through, Adam would feel that old ache in his chest. It wasn't physical. It wasn't about his body. It was the emotional weight, the gnawing feeling of having been betrayed by someone he had trusted completely. There were moments, fleeting but painful, when he wondered if he'd ever be able to trust again, not just Emily, but anyone. Would he ever be able to open his heart to someone else, without the fear that it would be torn apart again? But these thoughts, like the pain, faded with time. They didn't disappear completely, but Adam had learned how to live with them, how to set them aside when necessary. One afternoon, as he was sitting by the window, a knock at the door startled him. He wasn't expecting anyone, not that he had much of a social life these days, but the sound of it made his heart race for reasons he couldn't entirely understand. Maybe it was the fear of confrontation, of being forced to confront what had happened with Emily. Or maybe it was something deeper, a feeling of being vulnerable, exposed. When he opened the door, standing there was Derek. For a moment, Adam just stared at him, his eyes hard, his hands gripping the door frame as if it were the only thing holding him upright. Derek, as always, wore that same confident smirk, though it faltered when he saw the coldness in Adam's eyes. "Hey, man," Derek said, his tone overly casual, like nothing had changed. I thought we should talk, clear the air." Adam didn't respond immediately. He wanted to. He wanted to scream at him, to tell him exactly what he thought of him, of what had happened between him and Emily. But he knew something. Derek didn't. That speaking, reacting, any kind of outburst would give Derek the power, and Adam would not give him that. "Clear the air?" Adam repeated, his voice calm but laced with an edge that made Derek flinch. "There's nothing to clear, Derek. It's already been cleared." Derek's smirk faded into an awkward silence. He shifted on his feet, like a man who had expected this conversation to go much differently. "Look, I'm sorry about everything, okay? I didn't mean for it to go this far." "Really?" Adam's voice was steady, colder now. "You didn't mean for it to go this far? You didn't mean to sleep with my wife behind my back? You didn't mean to betray me while I was lying in a hospital bed, unable to move, unable to do anything?" Derek opened his mouth, but Adam held up his hand, stopping him before he could offer whatever lame excuse he had ready. "You don't get to apologize," Adam said, his eyes unblinking, his words deliberate. "You don't get to pretend that this was some kind of mistake. This was your choice. All of it. And I'm done pretending it was anything else." For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Derek stood there, his eyes darting around nervously. Adam could almost see the man he once thought was his neighbor, the one who always acted like a friend, scrambling to figure out how to salvage his dignity. But Adam wasn't interested in dignity anymore. Not Derek's, not Emily's, and especially not his own when it came at the cost of his own integrity. A new dawn. As the days turned into weeks, Adam's world became a quiet testament to resilience. Every morning, when the first light broke through the curtains, he found himself a little less afraid of the unknown. The paralysis of his body was slowly becoming something he could work with. His legs, stiff and unyielding, responded in small increments to the therapy. But it was his mind that had taken the greatest strides. The anger, the bitterness, the self-pity, he had learned how to quiet them, how to push them into the background, where they would no longer hold dominion over his thoughts. The house felt less empty now. With Emily gone, with Derek out of his life, Adam had finally come to terms with the fact that the home they had shared was now his alone, and that, in some strange way, made it his sanctuary. There was power in reclaiming a space that had once been the setting of his deepest heartbreak, a place where the walls seemed to whisper memories of betrayal and loss. But now, as he sat in his living room, looking out over the garden that had grown wild in the absence of care, Adam realized something important. Those memories, painful as they were, no longer had the power to define him. He could let them fade into the past, or he could keep them, learn from them, understand them, but not let them rule him. The first real breakthrough came when he decided to take a trip. It wasn't a grand journey or a quest for redemption. It was simply a visit to the small lake on the outskirts of town, the one he and Emily had visited countless times before. They used to go there on weekends, walking hand in hand along the water's edge, watching the sunset paint the sky in colors of orange and purple. It had always been a peaceful place for them. But now, it seemed, Adam needed to go there alone. Not for closure, not to relive the past, but to understand something important, who he was now and who he might still become. The drive was slow, the air crisp with the early signs of autumn. When Adam arrived, he wheeled himself down the path toward the water's edge, his hands gripping the wheelchair's handles, pushing with steady determination. The path was rough, the wheels bumping over pebbles and cracks, but it didn't matter. He was used to the effort. He was used to fighting against resistance, even if that resistance was his own body. When he reached the lake, Adam sat there for a long while, just staring out over the water. The wind rustled the leaves in the trees, and the soft lapping of the water against the shore was a calming sound. It reminded him of the quiet moments he used to share with Emily when everything in the world seemed perfect, when the future was full of promises. But those moments, Adam now knew, were not promises. They were illusions. Life wasn't a series of perfect, uninterrupted moments. It was a series of imperfect, fleeting experiences that shaped us in ways we couldn't always understand. The water stretched out in front of him peaceful and unchanging, and for the first time in months, Adam realized that he, too, could be like the lake. He could remain calm, still, despite the chaos that had once consumed him. His body might never be the same. His life might never be what it was, but he could adapt. He could find a way to be whole again, not despite the things that had happened to him, but because of them. Back in the town, things had changed too. A few weeks after his trip to the lake, Adam started to notice something new. People began to treat him differently. The sympathy he'd once felt suffocating, those sad looks, the murmured condolences, started to fade, replaced by something else: respect. They didn't pity him anymore. They saw him as he was, still Adam, still strong in his own way, still determined to move forward, no matter the obstacles. One afternoon, while he was sitting outside the local cafe, a familiar face approached him. It was Sarah, a woman who had lived in Ashford for as long as Adam could remember. She was kind, unassuming, and always one of the first to offer help when someone in town needed it. She had a warmth to her, a calm energy that made her easy to be around. "Mind if I sit?" she asked, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. Adam smiled and nodded, gesturing for her to take a seat. He'd known Sarah for years, but their conversations had always been polite, small talk here and there at the farmer's market or during town events. Nothing more than pleasantries. But today was different. Today, Adam could feel the shift in the air, the way people saw him now. Not as the man who had been betrayed, not as the broken man, but as someone who was trying to live, to move forward. "I saw you the other day," Sarah said, settling into the chair, her eyes bright with genuine curiosity. "Out by the lake. You looked peaceful." Adam nodded. He hadn't expected anyone to notice his little pilgrimage. The roots of a new life weeks passed, and the rhythm of Adam's days began to settle into something he could live with, something he could be proud of. The space Emily had once occupied in his life, while still heavy with memory, no longer held the same suffocating weight. It was as if, by finally letting go of the version of her he had held on to for so long, he had made room for the man he was becoming. Someone stronger, more grounded, someone who could stand tall, even if his legs still didn't work quite the way he wanted. Sarah's words lingered with him. "You've shown a kind of strength that's rare." They weren't the kind of words Adam was used to hearing. He had always been a private person, not one to seek validation from others. But hearing those words from her felt different. It was like a seed planted in him, something he wasn't sure would grow, but that, with time, began to take root. The garden, too, had become a symbol of his progress. What had once been wild and unruly was now slowly coming back under control. He spent hours each week tending to it, working with the soil, feeling the tangible connection between the effort he put in and the rewards that grew. It was slow, and the results were modest. But that was the beauty of it, the quiet, persistent effort of growth. It reminded him that even in the face of something broken, something could be rebuilt. 1. Afternoon, when the sun was just beginning to dip beneath the horizon, Adam sat by the window in the living room, his eyes scanning the horizon. The past few months had been a blur of small victories. Therapy sessions, slowly regaining more movement in his legs, reconnecting with the rhythm of life. But something had shifted within him, and he knew it was time for the next step. He had spent enough time with the remnants of his former life. He was ready to build something new. As if on cue, a knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Adam wasn't expecting anyone, and for a moment his mind wondered if it was Emily, though the thought was quickly dismissed. She had called once, some weeks ago, to ask if they could meet. He had declined. There was nothing left to say to her. But when he opened the door, it wasn't Emily. It was Sarah. "Hey," she greeted with a warm smile, her eyes bright and friendly. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "No, not at all," Adam replied, genuinely surprised. He gestured for her to come in. "I was just thinking about something." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "You mean plotting your world domination?" Adam chuckled. "Maybe a little. You never know, right?" She laughed, stepping inside. "I won't stay long, but I was wondering if you'd like to come by the town's community center tomorrow. They're hosting a sort of open house. People are showing off their hobbies, their crafts. A bit of a revival of sorts. Anyway, I'm volunteering, and I thought you might like to see what it's all about." Adam was quiet for a moment. He hadn't really thought about getting involved in town events since the accident. His days had felt so insular, focused on healing, on getting better. But there was something about Sarah's invitation, her earnestness, that made him pause. He could sense that it wasn't just a casual suggestion. It was an invitation to reconnect, to begin to take part in something larger than himself again. "I don't know," Adam said after a beat, his voice uncertain. "I haven't really been to many events like that since—" "I understand," Sarah interrupted gently. "But this isn't about them or what's happened in the past. It's just about you, finding something you enjoy. Something for you, Adam. If nothing else, it's a way to meet some new people. You don't have to do anything you're not ready for." Her words felt like an invitation into a world he had once been part of, but had distanced himself from. He was still wary, still uncertain about what he was capable of outside the cocoon he had built for himself. But Sarah was right. It wasn't about what had happened or who had betrayed him. It was about starting somewhere new, no matter how small. "I'll think about it," Adam finally said, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. "Thanks for asking, though." "Anytime," Sarah said, giving him an encouraging nod. "I'll see you tomorrow, then. No pressure." She turned to leave, but before she walked out the door, she glanced back at him. "I'm proud of you, Adam. You're doing better than you realize." The door clicked shut behind her, and Adam was left standing in the quiet of his home once again, but something inside him felt a little lighter. The thought of stepping outside his own world, of letting people in, wasn't as daunting as it once seemed. Maybe there was something worth exploring after all. The next day, Adam found himself wheeling his chair down the familiar streets of Ashford, the sun warm on his face, a slight breeze lifting the leaves from the trees. The winds of change. It had been several weeks since Adam first ventured out to the community showcase, and the sense of renewal he'd felt that day had continued to echo through his life. Though he still wrestled with the ghosts of his past, those quiet reminders of the life he had lost, something inside him had shifted. He could feel it in the way he moved through the days now, with purpose, with intention, as though each step mattered more because he knew how precious they were. Healing wasn't just about his body, it was about the life he was reclaiming piece by piece. Sarah's invitation had turned out to be more than just a casual suggestion. It had been the catalyst for something deeper, something more fundamental. Since that day at the showcase, Adam had begun to see the world through a different lens. He had started taking part in more community events, albeit on his terms. Sometimes it was as simple as sitting in the local cafe for a few hours watching. People come and go. Other times it was volunteering at the town's food pantry or lending a hand at town cleanup days. Each small act of participation was a stitch in the fabric of his new life, one he hadn't known he was ready to embrace until he did. But perhaps the most surprising development came in the form of a friendship that had quietly begun to bloom between Adam and Sarah. It wasn't dramatic or rushed. It didn't need to be. What had started with small talk at the showcase had turned into deeper, more meaningful conversations. They had begun to meet up regularly, sometimes for coffee, sometimes just for walks around the town's park, each of them finding comfort in the simple presence of the other. In Sarah, Adam had found someone who didn't expect anything from him, someone who saw him not as the man he had been or the man he could have been, but simply as Adam, a person, not a story, not a tragedy, not a symbol of suffering. And there was something healing in that. Adam realized that, for a long time, he had been too focused on fixing himself. But the truth was, maybe the process wasn't about fixing at all. Maybe it was about being. One evening, as the season shifted into the crispness of autumn, Adam found himself once again sitting at the small park near the lake. He was alone this time, having walked there on his own, pushing the wheelchair through the fallen leaves that crunched beneath his tires. The air was cool, a refreshing breeze carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. It felt good to be outside, to feel the weight of the world shifting in ways he couldn't quite explain. He had been reflecting a lot lately, about Emily, about Derek, about the life he'd once taken for granted. For the longest time, he had thought he needed to understand everything, to have all the answers to why things had gone so wrong. But now, something in him was beginning to accept that some questions didn't need answers. Some things just were. He could never fully understand the choices people made or the way life had unfolded, but he could understand his own path. And maybe that was enough. He wheeled himself down to the water's edge, watching as the lake's surface caught the last of the evening's light, turning the ripples into golden streaks. The lake, he thought, had always been a place of calm, a place where things seemed to pause just for a moment before moving again. He felt that same stillness now, as though time itself was holding its breath. It was then that he heard footsteps behind him. He turned, instinctively tensing, but when he saw Sarah walking toward him, her casual smile comforting in its familiarity, he let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "I thought I might find you here," Sarah said, her voice light and unburdened. Adam smiled in return. "You've been keeping tabs on me, huh?" "Only a little," she teased, sitting down on the grass beside him. "You've been a little quieter than usual lately. Figured you could use some company." For a moment they sat in comfortable silence, the only sound the rustle of leaves in the wind and the occasional bird call from somewhere in the trees. The sun was almost gone now, leaving a soft, fading light that seemed to wrap around them like a blanket. "You were right," Adam finally said, his voice soft. "About what you said the other day. About taking things one day at a time." Sarah raised an eyebrow, turning her head to face him more directly. "Oh?" Adam nodded slowly. "I've spent so much time trying to fix everything, trying to understand what went wrong, but it's not about that. It's about living. Just living, even if it's messy, even if it's not perfect. And maybe that's the part I wasn't ready to see." Sarah didn't say anything at first, but there was a quiet understanding in her eyes as she nodded. She knew, perhaps better than anyone else, how long Adam had struggled with the weight of the past. But now she could see the shift in him, the subtle but important. The open road. The drive to the coast wasn't long, but it felt like an eternity, or perhaps just the right amount of time for Adam to begin shedding the last remnants of his past self. The landscape shifted around them, rolling hills, small, towns dotted with weathered barns, and stretches of open fields where the horizon seemed endless. The farther they drove, the lighter Adam felt, as if the physical distance from Ashford, from everything that had weighed him down, was also carrying away some of his internal burdens. The car hummed steadily along the road, Sarah at the wheel. Her easy chatter about the places they passed, the quirky little roadside diners, the potential for adventure in the next town over, pulling Adam out of his own head. He listened, laughed, and found himself genuinely enjoying the journey, something he hadn't expected. It was just two people on a spontaneous trip, but in the simplicity of the moment, Adam felt a kind of peace that had eluded him for a long time. When they finally arrived at the small coastal town, the salty breeze hit them immediately, the sound of waves crashing against the shore a constant in the background. The town, though small, had a charming vibe. Cobblestone streets, colorful storefronts, and cafes that spilled out onto the sidewalks. There was a quiet, relaxed energy here, different from Ashford, but not so different that it felt foreign. The town was sleepy, but alive with possibility. As Sarah found a place for them to stay, Adam took a moment to breathe in the sea air, his eyes stretching over the water, where the waves lapped at the sand in a slow, rhythmic dance. There was something about the ocean that calmed him. Maybe it was the infinite expanse, the way it stretched beyond the horizon, reminding him that life, no matter how complicated, had its cycles. Even in the most turbulent of times, the sea would find a way to return to calm. As they unpacked and got settled into a cozy inn by the water, Sarah grinned at Adam. "How does it feel?" she asked, her voice teasing but genuinely curious. Adam looked around, taking in the soft golden light of the late afternoon, the sounds of seagulls in the distance. He thought about the journey, the open road, the quiet moments shared with her, and the strange sense of freedom he hadn't anticipated. "It feels like—" "I don't know," he said, smiling to himself. "Like the world is a lot bigger than I thought. Like there's more room to breathe." Sarah nodded, her expression softening with understanding. "That's the magic of new places, new experiences. They show us that there's more to life than what we see in the mirror every day." Adam turned toward her, his gaze thoughtful. "I never realized how small I'd made my world. How much I kept myself trapped in the same loop, thinking that if I could just fix one thing, the rest would fall into place. But it's more than that, isn't it? There's no fixing it. I've had to learn how to live with it." Sarah didn't answer immediately. She simply watched him, her eyes warm, steady. After a moment, she spoke, her voice gentle, like the soft crash of the waves behind them. "You're not alone in this, Adam. Not anymore." His chest tightened at her words, a lump forming in his throat. He wasn't sure if it was the weight of what he had lost or the depth of what he was beginning to realize about himself. He hadn't expected this trip to become so meaningful. But here he was, starting to piece together the fragments of a new life, one step at a time. And Sarah, she had been there, patient, understanding, without asking anything in return. After a long pause, Adam gave a quiet nod, his voice hoarse. "Thank you for being here, for not giving up on me." She smiled softly, a gesture that said more than words ever could. "You don't need to thank me, Adam. You're here, aren't you? That's enough." The next few days in the coastal town passed in a blur of exploration, quiet moments, and long conversations. Adam had always been someone who preferred the solitude of his own thoughts, but something about this place, about Sarah's company, made him feel like he could begin to open up in ways he hadn't allowed himself before. They wandered the beach together, collecting shells and talking about everything and nothing. They ate at local diners, laughed at jokes only the two of them understood, and spent hours simply sitting by the water watching the world move around them. For the first time in a long time, Adam felt like the weight of his past wasn't pulling him under. Instead, he was beginning to see how the parts of him that had been shattered could be remade, not by force, but by time and care. Like a piece of art, imperfect, yes, but beautiful in its own way. One afternoon, they ventured to a small cove near the edge of town. The walk down to the beach was narrow and steep, but once they arrived, they were rewarded with a secluded patch of sand, far from the more crowded tourist spots. New horizons. As autumn deepened, the days grew shorter, and Adam found himself back in his quiet routine in Ashford, though it felt somehow less suffocating than before. The trip to the coast had left its mark on him, not in grand gestures, but in small, transformative ways. The town felt the same, but he saw it through a new lens, like a photograph that had been sharpened into focus after years of being blurry. There was more room to breathe, more space for the possibility of joy, more freedom in the everyday. And yet, even in his new sense of peace, there were days when the old ghosts crept in, when memories of Emily would rise unbidden, or the deep anger at Derek would flare up, that gnawing feeling in his gut that he had never quite been able to release. But Adam was learning, slowly, to let those moments pass like clouds drifting across the sky. He didn't have to grab onto every thought or emotion, didn't have to let them define him. They were part of his story, but not the whole story. The days grew colder, but Adam's heart felt a little warmer. Sarah was still a constant in his life, though their relationship had settled into something more comfortable, more grounded than the earlier excitement of shared adventures. They saw each other often, sometimes for long talks over coffee, sometimes for walks through the changing landscape of the town, or quiet evenings at home. It wasn't romance, not in the conventional sense, but something deeper, a bond forged in shared understanding, mutual respect, and the kind of honesty that Adam had rarely allowed himself. But there was an unspoken tension, too. Sometimes, when their eyes would meet across the room, or during a pause in one of their conversations, Adam could sense the weight of something unaddressed between them. It wasn't that Sarah had ever pressured him. She hadn't. But there was a quiet hope in her eyes, one that Adam wasn't sure he was ready to face. He had spent so long rebuilding himself, brick by brick, that the thought of sharing that process with someone else, of allowing another person to see him not just as he was now, but as he was becoming, felt daunting. Still, in moments of vulnerability, when they'd sit by the fire sipping wine, the night stretching long ahead of them, he could feel something stirring within him. The walls he had spent so long constructing, brick by brick, were beginning to show cracks, just as the ones within him had. It was terrifying, but exhilarating too. One evening, just as the first frost began to coat the ground with a silvery sheen, Sarah invited Adam over for dinner. It had become a ritual of sorts, these quiet evenings where they shared a simple meal, nothing extravagant, but everything felt meaningful in its own way. Adam had come to look forward to these moments, not because of any expectation, but because of the ease of it, the sense that he could show up exactly as he was, without pretense. That evening, the house was warm, lit by the soft glow of candles and the flicker of the fire in the hearth. Sarah had made a stew, the smell of it rich and comforting in the air. Adam rolled himself up to the table, his hands resting lightly, on his knees as he took in the scene. It was quiet, peaceful, a place where he could let go of the world outside. "Smells incredible," Adam said, smiling as he inhaled the scent of rosemary, garlic, and the deep richness of the stew. Sarah beamed, the light from the candles catching in her eyes. "It's my mother's recipe," she said, ladling the stew into 2 bowls. "I make it whenever I need comfort, and I thought you might appreciate it too." Adam smiled, feeling. A warmth spread in his chest, not from the food, but from the gesture itself. There was something about the way Sarah cared for him, something simple yet profound. In all the chaos of his life, she had been a steady presence, a reminder that there were still things worth cherishing. They ate together in comfortable silence, the quiet punctuated by the occasional clink of silverware or the crackling of the fire. But as the meal drew to a close, Adam felt the weight of something lingering in the air, something unspoken, a quiet understanding that hung between them. "So, what's next for you?" Sarah asked, her voice casual but her eyes searching. "You've been through so much, and you've come so far. What's the next step in all of this?" Adam paused, setting his spoon down, the question more loaded than it initially seemed. It wasn't about the practicalities of his life, his therapy, his routines, his new hobbies. It was about something deeper, something that had begun to stir in him after the trip to the coast, something he couldn't quite define but that was there, pulsing beneath the surface. "I don't really know," Adam said, his voice softer than he intended. He looked at her, his heart giving a quiet thud in his chest. I think I'm still figuring that out." Unwritten pages. As the weeks of winter stretched on, Adam began to understand that life, at least for him, wasn't something that could be neatly planned or mapped out. There was no definitive blueprint for recovery, no clear instruction manual on how to live after everything had been broken. It was a dance, a series of small steps, sometimes graceful, sometimes clumsy, but always moving forward, slowly, sometimes imperceptibly, but still moving. Ashford, with its small-town rhythms and familiar streets, continued to be the stage for this subtle transformation. Adam found himself becoming a more active part of the community, not because he felt compelled to be, but because he wanted to be. He joined the local book club, something Sarah had mentioned in passing. He attended town meetings where he became more vocal about what he wanted for Ashford's future. Little things at first, like improving the park or adding more accessible ramps around town. Each moment felt like reclaiming a little more of himself, asserting that he still mattered in the grand scheme of things. And through all of it, Sarah remained his anchor. Their bond deepened without fanfare, like the steady growth of a tree in the forest, slow, constant, and unnoticed by those who rushed by. They didn't need to talk about it. They just were. They spent their evenings together more often than not, sharing simple meals and quiet conversations. And in the silences, there was always understanding. They weren't rushing toward anything. They were just allowing what was meant to be to unfold in its own time. One evening, as the snow began to blanket Ashford in a soft, hushed quiet, Sarah invited Adam over for dinner. This wasn't unusual. He had become a regular guest at her home, but tonight there was something different. The air between them had shifted, almost imperceptibly, like the change in the seasons that wasn't obvious until you really stopped to look for it. "Are you sure?" Adam asked as he wheeled himself up her front steps, noting the faint flicker of something in her eyes. He had learned to read her unspoken cues well by now, but tonight there was something that made him pause. "Absolutely," Sarah replied, her tone light, but with an edge of sincerity. "You're always welcome here." "Adam, you know that." He smiled, but the slight unease in his chest remained. As she led him into the warmth of her home, the familiar scent of rosemary and garlic greeting him once again, he couldn't shake the feeling that something important was about to happen. Not in any grand, dramatic sense, but in the subtle, meaningful way that life sometimes unfolds when you least expect it. Dinner was simple. Roast chicken, vegetables, and the same stew she'd made for him on their first evening together. They talked about everything and nothing, the rhythm of their conversation comfortable and unhurried. But as the evening wore on, there was an undercurrent to the air, a quiet tension that neither of them addressed directly. After dinner, as they moved into the living room, Sarah settled into the armchair opposite Adam, her fingers wrapped around a glass of wine. She looked at him, her gaze soft but steady. There was a kind of weight behind her eyes that made Adam's heart flutter, just a little. "Adam," she said, her voice quiet, almost tentative. "I've been thinking a lot, actually." Adam's brows furrowed slightly, his gaze shifting to hers. "About what?" She took a slow breath, her expression unreadable for a moment. "About us. About where we're both going with this." Adam's pulse quickened at the sound of her words, the air suddenly feeling thick, charged with a question that had never been spoken aloud before. Us. It wasn't something he'd actively thought about, at least not in concrete terms. But now, sitting across from Sarah, with the warmth of the fire crackling between them and the faint glow of the snow through the windows, it felt like the only thing that mattered. He swallowed, searching for the right words. "What do you mean?" "I mean—" She hesitated, a small, almost imperceptible shrug of her shoulders. "I think we've both been through a lot, and we've both changed. You've changed, Adam, and I've changed too. I know we've built this friendship, this connection over the past few months, but I have to ask, what comes next? Where do we go from here?" Adam's heart seemed to skip a beat. He hadn't realized until this moment just how much he'd been holding back, not just from Sarah, but from himself. He had convinced himself that he didn't need to rush into anything, that he could continue to move forward step by step without needing to define things. But in the stillness of this room, with the fire crackling softly and Sarah's gaze steady on him, Adam realized that there was something more between them, something that had been building in the spaces between their conversations, in the moments of shared laughter